Chapter 44 The Storm. The Seventh Hell.
"It's him!"
Krynen heard someone shout.
"He's here! He's over here!"
Thousands of sets of eyes were suddenly upon him, and Krynen stopped dead in his tracks. His vision darted back and forth as he nervously looked at everyone. Then his free hand awkwardly raised in greeting.
Hey!"
Krynen called out. At that, the people erupted in cheering. Weapons were raised into the air, and a chorus of voices drowned out Krynen's thoughts. He pursed his lips together and looked over at Malinka.
"What do I do?"
he asked.
"I've never—"
"Stand tall,"
Malinka replied. She squeezed his hand, and he straightened his back.
"You're their leader."
"By the brothers," Krynen griped. "I'm no good at shit like that."
"You're a fucking centurion and they're staring at you,"
Malinka hissed back.
"You look like an idiot."
"I am a fucking idiot,"
Krynen whispered. His head snapped up, and he imitated his father by putting on a fake, cheesy smile. He looked around, examining the hopeful faces that surrounded him. He wasn't sure exactly what to do, so he let go of Malinka's hand and drew his sword. He raised the weapon in the air, and the cheering erupted again.
"Well, they're easy to please,"
Krynen snorted.
"They just want to see that you're confident,"
Malinka replied.
"Watch this."
She cleared her throat and stepped forward.
"Good people,"
she shouted as she motioned for them to quiet down. She waited for a moment, and the roar hushed.
"I do not know how long you have all been here, whether it has been a century, a decade, or even only a year. Truly, it does not matter. What matters is that we are people all bound together through a common experience. In our time here, we have endured the sins and the oppression of the people of the Govian Empire. We have been killed, burned, tortured, raped, maimed. We have been treated like insects for the entertainment of the Govian citizenry. We are not people in their eyes. We are merely and simply objects to be played with. This ends today,"
Malinka continued.
"We are no longer cockroaches scurrying about in an effort not to be squashed or eaten. No, we are people, and we are a people united. We have been extended an opportunity, one that will enable us all to get revenge on those who have treated us like trash for so long. I know that we all have so much time separating us, so many years in between the eras in which we existed. We may not necessarily like the person standing next to us for whatever reason, but today we put those differences aside so that we can fight and destroy those who seek to dominate us. This is it, my brothers and sisters. Today we show Govia the power of the people. Our actions will reverberate for years to come, and those who come after us will know never to lay down and give up again. There is always a way, and we have found ours. People of Duran, if you hear my words, raise your swords to the sky."
Swords and weapons were lifted all around. Malinka grabbed Krynen's from him and raised it. Krynen shrugged at this and just lifted his pistol into the air.
"To us!"
Malinka shouted.
"May this movement be the catalyst that ultimately undoes the tyranny and oppression that has held us down for so long."
The army erupted in cheering once again, and Malinka smiled and handed the sword back to Krynen. He grabbed it and shook his head at her.
"Pretty neat, huh?"
she asked with a wide smile on her face.
"You're good,"
Krynen acknowledged.
"Much better than I would be."
"Yeah?"
Malinka asked innocently.
"Well, now it's your turn."
Malinka placed her hand on Krynen's back and pushed him hard. He stumbled forward, and suddenly all eyes were on him again. He looked out at everyone, feeling a lump growing in his throat. His jaw suddenly went slack, and he felt a drop of sweat drip down his back.
"Right,"
Krynen said as everyone quieted down. Many of the people nodded their heads at him, while some just patiently looked on. Krynen cleared his throat and blew out a nervous breath.
"Well, I'm Krynen,"
he said anxiously. He could hear the sound of Malinka's palm smacking against her forehead behind him. He cleared his throat, again, and took another step forward.
So, all my life I've been a soldier, he said. I've fought for what I believe is right. I've killed a lot of Govians. I've seen a lot of my allies die. I've bled, sweat, and fought for people who couldn't care less.
He nodded his head and took in a breath through his nostrils.
Yeah, for people who would rather just sit and let the Govians tell them what to do. I've seen the Govian normal. They barge into your homes, search through your stuff. They scan your bodies with computers and arrest you without reason. I've seen Govians burn down towns and execute any survivors on the side of the road. All for submission, all for wealth and power. They force their citizens into shard mines to dig up the crystals they use for power and currency. They tell us how long we're allowed to live and force us to believe in their goddess.
He paused, not exactly knowing where he was going with what he was saying.
It's all fucking stupid and I'm sick of it.
A few murmurs of agreement echoed out of the crowd, and Krynen nodded along with them.
Yeah, why should I live the way they want me to, you know? Why is it that because I'm alive, I have to submit to Govia? Why do I have to go to bed at night worrying whether I'll wake up on fire or on a cross or with a noose around my neck? I mean, I just want to grow old and have a damn cabbage farm.
Krynen, get to the point.
Malinka leaned in and whispered.
Sorry,
Krynen said, probably too loud.
Look, the point is, we're all here because Govia decided we had to be. It's not enough to control us in life. They have to control us in death, too, and it's time for that to end. I don't know how this fight is going to end. I don't know who will make it out alive or who will respawn in the first level or what. But I do know that no matter what happens, we are about to send Govia a message that even though we're dead, we can still fuck them up.
Krynen finished speaking and nodded confidently at his words. The crowd was silent. Krynen cleared his throat for a third time as he looked at all the faces out in front of him. Awkwardly, he turned and looked at Malinka.
Why aren't they cheering?
He leaned forward and whispered.
Always end in a question,
Malinka replied.
Oh, okay.
Krynen nodded and turned back to the crowd. He stepped forward and raised his head and took in a deep breath. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't think of anything. He paused for a second, looked back out at the crowd, and then saw Commander Emilio push through to the front.
So who is ready to take the power?
Emilio shouted. The crowd stirred at this, and the volume of Emilio's voice rose.
Who is ready to reach up with their hands, take hold of the power that Govia uses against you, and wrap it around their necks?
The crowd cheered, and Emilio bumped his fist into the air.
Who has the real power?
Emilio yelled.
We do!
The crowd disjointedly answered.
Say it loud so that the enemy can hear you, Emilio continued.
We
have the power!
The crowd screamed.
Then today, let's join the true demon, Krynen Jamesu. Let's fight harder than we ever have before, and let's break this fucking place so that no one will ever suffer here again.
The crowd went wild, and Emilio turned and walked straight to Krynen. He reached his hand out, walked past Krynen, and Malinka gave him a high five. Krynen frowned, but nodded his head. A little more practice, my young friend, Emilio whispered into Krynen's ear. He gave his shoulder a pat, and then Krynen turned to him.
Where did you come from?
Krynen nearly shouted. Why, one of the portals, Emilio replied. Saginius Lynx told us all how to get to you.
Oh, Sage.
Krynen nodded. Yes, I know not who this Sage Lynx is, Emilio shrugged, but for some reason, he wants you to live.
We all have our reasons,
another voice said. Krynen turned and saw Dolly walk up to him, and next to her was a slender, hooded she-elf with thick red hair emerging from one side of the hood. Krynen gasped at the sight, and he approached the two.
You're here,
Krynen said to the red-haired one. Like, in person?
Yes, Krynen,
Saracen replied.
I decided to fight alongside you. In my own body. Don't worry, they won't recognize me. And I'll be right at your side, so do not fear.
Dolly smiled and punched Krynen in the shoulder.
Hey, you!
She chirped.
You made it! That makes me totes happy.
She glanced over at the others and gasped.
You!
She shouted, pointing at Karsten.
Come on, I want to take you to someone before the fight starts.
Me?
Karsten asked, scrunching up his brow.
Yes, you, come on.
She beckoned him to follow, and Karsten shrugged and took a step.
Someone wants to see you.
His eyes grew wide as he realized where Dolly was taking him.
My family?
The tone of his voice suddenly went up, and he looked over at Krynen as a large smile formed on his face.
Who else?
Dolly asked with a smile. Karsten closed his eyes and choked back his tears as he turned to Krynen.
Well, if I don't see you again,
he said with a trembling voice,
you done did me right, partner. I ain't never gonna forget what you done for me here. You're all right in my book, Krynen Jameso.
Karsten extended his hand, and Krynen grabbed it. Karsten quickly pulled Krynen into a hug and patted his back hard. Finally, with a sniffle, he let go, straightened his hat, and walked away.
Oh, and don't forget what I said back there,
he called back.
Don't you ever guess what she wants. Be a real badass and talk to her.
Karsten gave Krynen a wink and then followed Dolly away. Krynen watched Karsten walk and couldn't keep back the smile that formed on his face. The old rancher deserved whatever happiness was in store for him. Krynen nodded his head and sighed heavily. It was about time for him to find his own happiness, too.
Let's get this moving,
Krynen said as he turned around. Saracen, Malenka, and Emilio looked at him and nodded, and then Krynen briefly glanced at Eon, who stood off to the side watching with a contemptuous smile on his face. Malenka, Emilio, and the Black Knights all followed Krynen as he made his way to the front of the army to set into motion whatever was about to happen. Sage.
Yes, I know he's in the 7th level,
Sage snapped at Lukas as he worked frantically to bypass the extra security measures that Govia and Farseer were actively deploying. They were fighting against him. They knew something was about to happen, and they were working hard to ensure that Sage failed.
I'm just saying, Dad, Lukas argued. It's time. Not just yet, son,
Sage said through gritted teeth. Taking down the firewalls and encrypting the codes to gain access to the stream that controlled all the data going out of the Hells was tedious, and Sage didn't have room for error. He furiously typed at his keyboard and then reached up and wiped the sweat from his brow before it dripped into his eyes.
"They're really putting up a fight,"
Lukas admitted. He too was hammering at his keys and was nearly panting from all the effort he put in.
"It's like they're pulling new code out of their asses. If I could just—"
Lukas's eyes went wide, and he leaned in closer to his computer monitor. He gasped, and his fingers started gliding across the keys faster than they were before.
"Oh yeah, there we go!"
He smashed the enter button and spun in his chair to face his father with a wide grin on his face.
"They're fucking locked out!"
Lukas cheered.
"We have full control over the data stream!"
"You amazing boy," Sage said before he belted a laugh. He stood up from his chair, walked over, and wrapped his arms around his son.
"You have done it! I should say you have outcoded me, son!"
With tears in his eyes, Sage lifted Lukas off the ground and spun in place. He put the boy down and leaned in closer to his computer.
"Fortify it,"
Sage ordered, but reached out and began typing commands on Lukas's keyboard.
"I will call the security team and inform them that we have access so they can bolster our defenses.
This will not last forever, but—" He looked over at his boy, his eyes nearly glowing with pride.
"I should say, you just undid what has taken the Govians centuries of coding to accomplish."
"Well," Lukas said, his smile nearly as wide as his father's, "I learned from the best." Sage's fingers halted for a moment. With a sad nod, he looked over at his son and reached up. He touched the boy's cheek and sighed. "That you did, my son," Sage said as he continued his code and stepped back from the terminal. He pulled out his phone and motioned for Lukas to continue. "Okay, time to get back to work. I am proud of you, Lucas. The 7th level. Krynen stood alongside Emilio and Malinka at the front of the army. Across the battlefield, they could see the horde of players was larger than Krynen could have imagined. Their armor and weapons glowed. They jumped in place, and a few were dancing? Krynen watched the strange sight and then turned to Saracen.
What are they doing? He asked with a confused tone. Why are they moving like that?
Because they're idiots,
Saracen replied, shaking her head at the sight.
Morons dance like that in the real world, too. They think it's funny.
Krynen snorted and then turned to Malinka.
Well, this is it, Krynen said. Now we just wait for something to happen. Ancient Nane uses on me, Eon shouted, smiling as he walked past Krynen. We will be your vanguard, Krynen. Let us, the mightiest here, charge into battle, wielding the power we created that we may lay waste to our enemies in your name and pave the way to your glory. Sure,
Krynen nodded, then turned and looked at Malinka.
Will you stay by my side?
Always.
Malinka smiled, and then Krynen lifted her hand and kissed it. She took a deep breath, and as she exhaled, she pulled her axes from her hips.
Let's do this.
Krynen walked forward and raised his sword. The army behind him followed suit, and as Krynen got closer, he spoke again.
Do it for the ones you still love, he shouted. For their memory. Do it for the hope that all this one day may end, that we may all somehow find peace. Fight for yourselves, for every thought your mind has ever created. Make it matter. Make it worth something. It's time to show these fuckers what you can do. It's time to shove our fucking blades down their throats.
Krynen looked over at Malinka, and she gave him a look of expectation.
The question,
she whispered.
Oh,
Krynen replied.
Who's ready to turn these shitheads into a stain on the ground?
The army behind him cheered, and Krynen looked over at Malinka and smiled widely. Neon's feet floated up off the ground, and many of his ancient warriors did as well.
Advance!
He shouted. At that, hundreds of ancients charged forward, hovering, phasing, and running behind Eon. The player army followed suit, their largest and heaviest armored running forward to intercept the first wave. Krynen looked to Malinka, and then Malinka turned toward the enemy.
Archers!
Emilio shouted, raising his hand into the air.
Lock your bows. Wait for my mark.
Nearly 100 soldiers lined up in rows in front of Emilio. He stood behind them all and held his open hand in the air.
20 more steps,
Emilio shouted. Krynen turned to his right, where Vasily Emil stood with a wide grin on his face.
I guess that leaves us,
Krynen shouted toward them.
The infantry. 5 steps,
he heard Emilio shout.
Steady, aim, loose!
A volley of arrows shot over Eon's division and struck the charging demons. Some fell, and the rest continued moving forward with their assault.
Infantry, prepare your swords for feeding,
Vasily shouted to the soldiers with him.
We determine outcome of battle. Here is best advice I have. Stay on feet. Don't drop sword.
Vasily heard laughter from within his ranks, and he smiled a bit himself.
Let's go, fuckers!
He shouted. At that, Krynen and Malinka ran side by side as they hurried to reinforce the first wave. For a moment, it was quiet. All the sound, the chaos around him, it all died out, and Krynen only heard his breath and felt his pulse. The battle was getting closer, closer. Finally, he spun the sword in his hand and charged past the ancients and into the fray, immediately driving his sword through the chest of the first player he saw.
Player Kevolution executed. Player rank 2,478,654,789. Congratulations, pretty kitty 6969420. You have advanced in ranking. Previous rank 3,327,396,763. New rank 2,903,025,776. Previous percentile, 11%. New percentile, 9%. New percentile achieved. Congratulations, you are showing your true power. Your buffs have been completely removed. Cosmetic items unlocked. See your wardrobe for more details. Congratulations, you have crossed the threshold of the 10th percentile and into the top 10. Ability unlocked. Portal, level 7, grants player the ability to summon a portal to the 7th level of Hellscape anywhere portals are permitted.
As the sounds around him returned, he heard the war cries of the infantry as they burst into the battle. The sound of steel on steel, the cries of the dying, and the steady hum of magic filled his ears, and as he pulled the sword from the player, he turned to make sure Malinka was still with him. He watched her cleave through a player's throat and nodded as he charged forward, engaging another. The player swung an axe at Krynen. He jumped backward, bumping into someone as he did, and raised his sword to block another attack.
"Fuck off me!"
he shouted as he spun, slicing through the demon's arm and relieving him of his sword hand. The player reeled back, and Krynen watched as a heavy two-handed axe removed his head. The headless player fell to the ground, and Krynen saw his former squadmate, Jeff Skaven, give him a wink and charge back into battle. A player charged Malinka, but she ducked down and swiped her leg at him, knocking his feet out from under him. He tumbled forward, and before he could hit the ground, Malinka had planted both her axes into his chest. Krynen ran past her and threw a lightning bolt into the demon's head, knocking a few over and allowing him to decapitate the one who still stood.
Player, Neb, executed. Player rank, 67,112. Congratulations, Pretty Kitty, 69,420. You have advanced in rank. Previous rank, 2,903,025,776. New rank, 1,451,546,444. Previous percentile, 9%. New percentile, 4%.
"You okay?" Krynen shouted at Malinka.
Awesome.
She returned as she pulled her axes from a demon's back.
You?
Ready for this to be over,
Krynen growled.
Ah, shit! Incoming!
Krynen watched as at least a dozen demons charged his way. He and Malinka stood side by side, prepared to engage them, when Krynen suddenly heard the sound of hooves. Looking to his left toward the direction of the sound, Krynen watched as a mob of ethereal horses charged forward, all being ridden by people with wide-brimmed hats, revolvers, and repeater rifles. They whooped and laughed as they rode, and Krynen watched the white smoke lift from their weapons as they mowed down the players. Any who still stood were trampled by the horses. Krynen saw Karsten among them, being flanked by who he could only assume were his sons, and he couldn't help but smile.
Get back in the fight.
Saracen shouted as she phased in front of him.
Watching is for losers.
She faced forward, and Krynen watched her employ a strange sort of martial arts paired with her magical attacks. She punched a player square in the chest, leaving a hole from the impact, and then sent his body flying across the battlefield. She threw waves of invisible power, knocking people to the ground, and Krynen even watched her kick someone in the head and literally punt the head into the distance. The darkness above groaned and trembled, and Krynen looked up as the sky seemed to split open. A brilliant blue light emerged from behind the crack that had formed, and Krynen immediately realized that he was looking at his way home.
"That's fucking it!" Krynen shouted, amazed at the sight. "That's gotta be the way home, Malinka!"
He looked back at Malinka and saw that she was struggling to fend off 4 players.
"Get off her!"
he shouted as he leapt forward. He cut through one of the player's skulls and then crashed down on top of another. His sword impaled the player in the chest, and Krynen lost grip of it. He rolled forward, grabbed the player's face, and blasted into it with a lightning bolt. The player's head exploded, and Krynen crashed to the ground.
Player, Darkontra Trout, executed. Player rank, 7,776. Congratulations, Pretty Kitty, 69,420. You have advanced in ranking. Previous rank, 1,451,546,444. New rank, 725,777,110. Previous percentile, 4%. New percentile, 2%. Player, Pixel Dust, executed. Player rank, 78,498. Congratulations, Pretty Kitty 6969420. You have advanced in ranking. Previous rank, 725,777,110. New rank, 362,927,804. Previous percentile, 2%. New percentile, 1%. Congratulations, Pretty Kitty 6969420. You have reached the top 1% of all players in Hellscape. For your outstanding efforts and battle prowess, new and exciting employment opportunities will be available to you at your local Inquisitor's office. Also, enjoy premium access to venues and priority treatment at your local Spring Mart. Cosmetic items unlocked. See your wardrobe for more details.
That was dumb.
Malinka shouted as she ran over and helped Krynen up off the ground. Krynen found his balance, kissed Malinka on the lips, and then turned and wiggled his sword free from the player's chest. He brushed his hair out of his face and pointed upward.
I hit the 1%, Krynen snorted. And I don't even fucking care.
He pointed up at the portal that had opened in the sky.
That's where we need to go,
he shouted. He saw that a great number of his army had turned to run toward the blue rift in the sky. He also saw that many of them were being cut down as they ran. He cursed and grabbed Malinka's hand.
Let's go,
he said, nodding forward toward the rift.
Time to end this.
Malinka nodded, but before they could run, they were both blasted violently onto their backs.
It seems that the way home has presented itself,
the voice of Eon declared as he appeared in front of them.
It is then time for me to take what I need and leave this place. Fuck off, Eon,
Krynen yelled as he scrambled to his feet.
Just go. Nobody's stopping you.
You see, that could not be further from the truth, Eon said as he floated closer to Krynen.
You, Krynen, are stopping me. I need what is locked away within you.
With a growl, Krynen darted forward, swinging his sword towards Eon's chest. Eon, in turn, held his hand out, and Krynen suddenly froze in place with his sword hovering only inches from Eon's body. His spine felt ice cold, and he couldn't move anything but his eyes as he watched Eon.
Your parents seem to have put something special within you,
Eon said softly as he stepped forward and cupped Krynen's cheek in his hand.
Something you were born with, something that has always been there. I feel it is mine to take, Krynen, for it is of no use to you.
Get away from him!
Malinka shouted as she dove forward, axes at the ready. Eon caught her mid-air with his abilities and slammed her to the ground. Malinka screamed and Eon snarled at her.
I could destroy your bodies right now, you foolish children. I could blast you into nothing. Oh, wait. I can make you cut her throat and drink until you burst, Krynen.
Eon snarled and placed his hands against each of Krynen's temples.
It is time for you to open the repository, my friend, for the knowledge contained within. No!
Eon suddenly shouted as he dropped his hands and stepped backwards. He started panting heavily, and Krynen and Malinka were both freed from their captivity. Krynen stumbled forward, crashing to the ground, and Malinka ran to his side.
Run! Krynen!
Eon struggled to shout.
Go home!
Ander!
Malinka gasped. She moved to run forward, but Krynen grabbed her arm and pulled her back.
I cannot hold him,
Ander growled.
Thank you for being my friend.
Ander!
Malinka yelled.
Ander, I'm so sorry.
No,
Ander insisted.
Go and live!
At that, Eon's face formed into a furious scowl as he took back over. Ander did not say another word, and Eon stomped forward.
I have endured enough of this foolishness,
Eon growled. He threw his hand out, knocking Krynen and Malinka onto their backs.
Do not resist!
Krynen felt his ribs crack as he slammed against the ground and yelped in sudden pain. He stared up at Eon with fury in his eyes. He was so close to getting Malinka out of there. He could see the rift only a few hundred yards away.
I will have it, Eon continued. It is mine!
He reached forward only for a wave of invisible power to slam against the side of his body. He tumbled to the ground, surprised, just as Saracen ran into view and blasted him again, holding him down with her abilities.
Fucking go!
Saracen yelled, her voice strained by the amount of energy she was using.
Now!
Malinka got to her feet, but Krynen could barely move. He struggled to push himself up and then felt Malinka hook her arms underneath him.
Come on,
she encouraged him.
We're almost there. Get up, come on.
Krynen groaned in pain as she helped lift him to his feet. He put his weight on her and she grunted as she helped him walk forward. Slowly, the two inched toward the portal. Every step sent a shock through Krynen's broken body. He felt like there was no way he was going to make it. Gravity kept pulling him down, and finally Malinka could hold on no longer, and he tumbled to the ground again.
I can't, Krynen whispered. I can't breathe. I can't walk. You go and save yourself. That's all that really matters to me.
No,
Malinka insisted. She tugged on his arm, trying to force him to his feet, but Krynen didn't have the strength to stand.
No, I won't leave you.
You have to,
Krynen tried to yell back.
Please!
A shadow fell over the two, and Krynen turned his head to see a tall, white, corpulent monster towering over them. He wore a grin on his face and held a large hook out in front of him.
Well, what an opportunity we have here,
Big Dick declared as he stared down at the two.
How easy it would be for me to get my revenge.
Go away,
Malinka shouted. She got to her feet and raised her axes toward the demon who had bitten Krynen's head off so long ago. Big Dick rolled his eyes and lumbered past Malinka, gently pushing her aside.
It's okay,
he said as he tossed his hook to the ground. He knelt down and picked Krynen up, cradling him like a baby.
Sometimes people have to look death in the eye to realize exactly how big a piece of shit that they are.
Big Dick stood back to his feet and looked toward the rift.
Lead the way, little lady.
Malinka nodded and ran toward the rift. As she got closer, she felt the pull of the blue portal grow in intensity and saw that people were tossing themselves in by the dozen. As they ran, others formed up behind them, protecting them from incoming fire and anyone who would wish them harm. Dolly ran up alongside Big Dick and grabbed Krynen's hand, sending as much healing energy as she could into him. Krynen felt some strength return to him, though his pain did not fade. They finally reached a place where the rift's pull could only barely be resisted, and Big Dick set Krynen down and gently helped him to his feet.
Well, that was weird,
Krynen grunted as he babied his ribs.
Thanks, I guess. No, Krynen Jameso,
Big Dick said with a shake of his head.
Thank you for showing me the way. Things are going to change in my life. I promise you.
Good, I guess, Krynen said. Big Dick nodded to him and then stepped forward. Krynen watched as the lumbering demon was sucked into the rift, and then looked around him.
Go, Krynen!
He heard Commander Emilio shout.
Go home. The Seraphim have no place there. We will remain behind and guide those who follow.
Krynen nodded to Emilio and turned to see Sir Edmund on his other side.
I'm proud of you, Krynen,
Edmund shouted. It was hard to hear him over the wind, but Edmund reached out and slapped Krynen on the shoulder.
Take care of my sister,
Sir Demian added.
Just so you know, I approve of all this.
Krynen nodded to Demi and Emil, and then turned to Malinka. The deep, rolling sound of roaring and crackling fire filled their ears. The wind created by the release of the immense power surging around them blew their hair in all directions. Everything was covered in a blue hue from the rift that pulsed above, yet they somehow found themselves standing calmly in the middle of it all, safe only because they had each other. Above them, in the pure and absolute blackness of the sky, the rift had surged. A swirling blue gash hung in the never-ending nothingness. They felt the unknown force tugging at them, beckoning them to enter.
"I will find you,"
Crinan whispered his promise as he leaned into Malinka's ear. He pulled back and stared at her.
"I promise you, Malinka. I will come back to you, wherever you are."
I will be waiting,
she shouted as the force of the rift lifted her feet off the ground. Crinan held onto her hand, and he could not take his eyes off her. The rift pulled at her harder, but his love gave him the strength to pull her down and push his lips against hers one more time.
"I love you,"
he whispered as he finally let go of her hand. Her fingers caressed his cheek, and she smiled as the rift pulled her upward. Their eyes remained locked, and Crinan saw her mouth the words.
I love you too.
"I will find you, Malinka. I promise."
A moment later, she was gone, carried into the sky just like Crinan had been back when they were so young in Camelot. When he was left alone, Crinan spun in place as he surveyed the hells one last time. The battle raged on as people scrambled to get into the rift. He saw an entire horde of Touched get sucked in, watched as players and prisoners alike threw themselves at the swirling blue light. Crinan looked over to where Saracen and Eon had been and saw they were both gone. He sighed and spun in place until he too was looking at the light.
Go, Crinan!
Dolly shouted as she approached him. She grabbed his arm and squeezed tight.
Thank you so much for saving us all.
"Dolly,"
Crinan replied. He reached out and grabbed her hand, squeezing hard.
"Go finish your life."
I will.
Dolly sniffled as she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek.
And you be good to Malinka. Be good to yourself. I will never forget you.
At that, Dolly reached forward and pushed Crinan. He lost his balance, dropped his sword, and the rift plucked his body from the ground. The blue light grew brighter and brighter as he got closer, and eventually he was sucked into it, and it became all that he could see. The world of the hells quickly faded from his mind, and as the blue light that surrounded him turned white, Crinan Jameso opened his eyes, and he heard a simple sentence uttered by a very familiar voice. "I should say, whoever touched the thermostat is going to get it." End of Age of Reckoning, Book 1.